Hi, this is Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington, and today I wanted to talk about saddles and shims and different ways that we shim saddles, that we see saddles shimmed, and maybe talk about why some of these methods might be better than others. I do have some opinions about this, and I think that they're valid opinions, and I'll explain why in this video. Anyway, this is an Alvarez guitar that came in for a little bit of work this week. It's getting some bone bridge pins installed, which you can see here. It's also getting a custom bone nut, and it's getting a setup, but we're keeping the stock saddle, which is made of tusk or new bone or, one of the nicer plastics that you see these days for nuts or saddles. And when I went to go and pull that saddle out, I noticed this little guy here. And this is a really common sight that you're going to see down inside the saddle slot in a lot of cases where somebody in the past felt like they wanted to raise the action up a little bit by either like a 32nd or a 64th and just give it like a little ootsy, more height. And this shim here, what it's doing is it's lifting the saddle on the side that needed more height, in this case the bass side. Now, these sorts of shims that look like this, they're oftentimes made of a number of different materials. A lot of times you're going to see binding scrap that was used for this. Sometimes you'll see cut credit cards or cut business cards, stuff like that. In some cases, you'll see things like there are these polystyrene strips that you can get at hobby shops for building like model train dioramas and stuff like that. That's a really popular choice as well, just because they happen to come in 3/32 and 1/8 inch sizes, which are handy for fitting inside the same size saddle slots, which tend to be the most common. So, kind of like I talked about in my past video about neck shims, is unfortunately one of the more popular methods that you see. And it's unfortunate that it's that popular because it's really not the best. Let me go ahead and explain what's going on here when you do this. Now, I mentioned that you are raising the saddle, and that can't be denied in this case, but what you're also doing is you're breaking the contact between the bottom of the saddle, which is taking all of the energy from the strings. So you're breaking the contact between that saddle and the bottom of the bridge slot. So say we have our bridge slot here. Imagine that this is a bridge sort of bisected, kind of along the bridge slot. So we're looking at kind of the side here of the bridge slot. And you have a little shim in here. So this is a bit of an exaggerated view, but this is just going to give you a good idea of what we're dealing with here. Now, what's happening here is that the flat bottom of this saddle is making contact with the shim, with the corner over here and with the side, but you'll notice that that saddle has this huge gap under here where it's really not making contact with the bottom of the bridge. Now, this is a problem especially in cases where you have an undersaddle pickup, in which case any spot that's not making contact like this, you're not going to be getting any signal from those areas of the piezo. And so you may have strings that have gone completely dead silent or very quiet compared to other strings on the instrument. And it's just because there's this lack of contact. Meanwhile, if you have that piezo in there under there, you might notice that it's really hella loud underneath where that shim is, because that shim is taking a brunt of a lot of pressure and pressing it down on top of one particular area of the element. Likewise, wherever this corner meets, you're probably going to get a lot of signal as well. But in between there, you're not going to be getting anything. Now, that's, with a pickup, but I'll say also that your guitar, it produces energy in a particular way. You could imagine a guitar as sort of a speaker cone that works with kinetic energy instead of electric energy, like your speaker cones in your stereo. What's happening is basically that your strings, which are, sitting atop this saddle here, are vibrating, and the force from that vibration is going into the saddle here, and then that saddle is transmitting that energy from the string to the saddle, to the bottom of that saddle slot, and then out into the bridge, which carries it to the braces, which carries it out into the soundboard to create that movement that moves air to create those sound waves. So if you have a gap here, like a physical gap between the thing that's holding up the strings and the thing that that's supposed to be coming in contact with, that's a lot of kinetic energy that's being lost. And so even if you don't have a piezo pickup under here, you're losing a fair bit of volume from different areas and not really getting the best sound out of the guitar. Materials wise, just in terms of tone, you know, we've talked about like, I think different saddle and nut materials on this channel before. Usually, you know, kind of the best sound that you're going to get, the best tone that you're going to get is with a bone saddle. There's going to be some disagreement in this in the comments, I'm sure. You know, in this case, we're using this tusk or whatever. Some people prefer that tone. But the bottom line is that you want the materials that are doing this transmission of energy to be materials that are going to do that well and produce the kind of predictable and nice sound that you want. And those kind of materials are going to be like bone, micarta, tusk, new bone, corian, any of the materials that we will popularly go to as luthiers to carve parts like this. What we're not going to do is we're not going to carve you a saddle out of polystyrene or out of the same material that like credit cards are made out of, or we're not going to cut you a saddle out of binding material, because that just is going to sound really crappy, isn't it? So we don't really want to put anything like that in here, because if you draw further that analogy of the guitar being kind of an electric speaker, you could imagine this thing as being kind of a low-pass filter that's being put in just because softer materials tend to resonate with lower frequencies. And so when you're putting in one of those softer materials, you're kind of keying this thing to maybe produce a little, well, it won't produce more bass, but it'll cut out some treble. So you're not gaining any bass frequencies, you're really losing treble frequencies. And so, you know, if you're somebody who does home recording and you're used to being able to control everything with that EQ, just keep in mind that always more frequencies are better when you're going to be doing EQ work. You can always take away frequencies that you have, but you can't add frequencies that were never there. So how can we deal with this in situations where we want to keep the original saddle, but we do need to add some material to get a little bit of height? Well, there's a better way to do this, as you know, you might have predicted getting into this video, and that is, so we take the saddle, this is an exaggerated radius on top of the saddle, and we glue it to some material. So we basically coat the bottom here in some CA glue or hide glue or whatever the hell you want to use, and we glue that to like a piece of whatever the bridge is made out of, usually is my preference. So in this case, we'd be using rosewood. And so we'd be gluing a piece of rosewood on the bottom. We'd be trimming up that rosewood so it's all nice and flush with the saddle. And what we'd end up with at the end of the day is something that looks like this. So you see on the bottom, we have this strip of rosewood that's now adhered to the bottom of the saddle. Now when we go to do the setup and we need to take material out from the bottom of the saddle to kind of dial things in, usually we're going to be taking material off of the treble side. You know, we're going to be cutting this entire strip down with the sanding wheel, that entire strip. And so we're still going to have a solid meeting point for that saddle slot and what ostensibly is the saddle. And so let me show you what that's going to look like. So down in the slot, here's our saddle slot. I'm going to draw things really tall here, really exaggerated, so that you can really see what's going on. So here's our saddle, top of our saddle slot here. And then down below, what you're going to have is something like this. So here's our basically what amounts to a full pocket shim in the bottom of that saddle slot. So that is forming our solid contact with the bottom. And that's actually taking the energy from the strings, going through that bone or whatever the saddle is made out of, going into that shim, which is made out of the same material as the bridge, and then going down into the bridge. And so that's how we can do that. So, you know, when you see something like that done, it's usually going to end up looking something like this guy here. This is a saddle. It's a tusk saddle. It looks like that has been done to at some point. You can see that this one was also done with rosewood. And it looks slick too. Like when you pull one of these out, it looks nicer, it feels nicer, and it provides better tone. This is kind of similar to the principle of using a slip shim in a neck shimming situation versus using a full pocket shim. It's better to have more contact. Let me talk about one last thing here in this video, because some of you might be thinking, what's the harm, if I go ahead and put one of these in? You know how we were talking about there being a lot of pressure in that one particular area? So the saddle is here, it's making contact over here, and then it's putting a whole lot of downward pressure on this shim that's here. If we go over here and we look, do you see this little indentation here that starts about where the tip of my scratch awl is? Kind of riding the edge of it there. And you see how that little angle there kind of matches the angle over here of this shim? That is because that is a dent that has been pushed into the bottom of that saddle slot, straight into the wood in the very shape of this shim that was in there. And so basically what's going to happen now when we go to, do this properly, is that we're now dealing with a saddle slot that looks something like this. And so we've got a little bit of a trench here. So even if we make the bottom of that saddle that's going in there perfectly flat so it contacts everything over here, we now have this area that's going to have a gap in it. And so again, we're going to have the same issues that this creates. So we may have a little bit less volume on those bass strings where that dent is. If we were putting a pickup in there, we might have to do some paper shims or something to get more pressure down on the piezo in that area of the saddle slot, just because we have that gap there and it's not going to provide as much pressure as we need, or at least it's certainly not going to keep up with the pressure that's on the piezo in the rest of this area that's making full contact. This is an instance, kind of like that neck pocket shim video that I did a while back, where somebody may be putting something in thinking, okay, this is a quick fix, but it's harmless, but it's not actually harmless. It's doing some real damage to the instrument while it's in there. And so, it really does behoove a player to really get the right kind of work done in these instances, rather than trying to kind of cut corners or going to somebody who's going to cut corners and put something like this in and, damage the bottom of a bridge slot, a saddle slot, or, in the case of the neck shim, damage the shape of the neck, which we were talking about in that video. Acoustic guitars are under an enormous amount of pressure, and so the fact that it dented into that rosewood isn't surprising to me at all. Rosewood is a really tough wood, but no wood is impervious to over 100 pounds of pressure over a period of time being pressed into one particular point. And, a shim like that is really good at concentrating a lot of pressure in one particular area, and so it's kind of not surprising to me that this is the kind of thing that happens. So this is all stuff that's worth thinking about if you're getting into a setup situation and you find yourself looking at the action after you got the nut dialed in, after you got the neck relief dialed in, and you're looking at the string height and you're thinking, okay, this is still really low. Or maybe you had to correct for a radius, and then after correcting for the radius, the saddle ended up being a little low. And you're looking at it going, well, I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater with the saddle, so I want to shim it. This is stuff that you should be considering when you make that decision and when you make the decision about how to do it. Because this gluing this stuff on the bottom, it really doesn't take that long. I mean, I'd say that this maybe adds like 10, 15 minutes tops to doing a setup on one of these guitars. I mean, I do charge like slightly extra for it sometimes if it's a particularly annoying guitar, but most of the time I just kind of chalk it up to, this guitar took longer, another guitar will take less time, and as far as the cost to my customer. And so there's no reason to not do this the right way, and it's really not going to serve you in the end to, even just do it for a little while. I want to say that the only instance in which I would maybe recommend doing this kind of slip shim in the bottom of a saddle slot would be in like a road tour. Hey, somebody needs this guitar in like 5 minutes. Even then I would say like, well, what were you doing the night before the show? Like, did you take a look at the guitars? Were you doing the setup work on those? There were better ways to handle this before the show started. Like, I think that the right solution is usually going to be the best solution in most cases. And Doing the full shim along the bottom of the saddle is the correct solution when you need to add a little bit of height to a saddle. Anyway, this has been Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington. If you enjoyed this video, found it entertaining, I have a link to my Ko-Fi and my Patreon in the description of the video. If you feel like kicking me any money, that really helps me make these videos. It does take some time out of my day to do these, and I enjoy putting these videos out for you guys. So hopefully, you'll enjoy this one. I have a link down in the description also to my Reverb page where you can find some instruments that I sell and some other stuff, and also a link to my website where I have my pricing page, my contact information, and also a page that I wrote on caring for stringed instruments, which I imagine that you probably have a few that you do care for. There's also a new page that I've added recently to my website. If you go to the price page and click on any of the hyperlinks under fretwork, you'll come to the page, the big article that I just wrote about fretwork. Everything that you ever wanted to know about fret wire, fretwork, going fretless, any of that kind of stuff that has to deal with a guitar fretboard, it's probably going to be in there. And if it's not, contact me and let me know that you have a question about it, because I'd like to fill any gaps in that page if there are any. There are lots more videos like this on my channel. If I remember, I'll link the one about neck pockets in the description, and you can check that one out as well. Link them around to friends, link them around to people who who are into this kind of geeky stuff, and it always helps send more people my way. Again, this has been Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington. Thank you for watching.